My new skill.
All right, so okay, everybody, we're gonna start. We're gonna start now. Thank you all for coming on a rainy night here. So welcome to Eastpointe's movie critic discussion night. I'm Ed Katz, and for those of you who don't know me, there's a few new faces here. I was a film major in college, and I also did theater and film reviews up at a radio station in Connecticut for a couple of years. And we've been doing this now for about 2 years. So thank you. I appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Everyone, if you have a phone, that if you could please mute it, I would appreciate it if it's not already.
Right, you know what?
And I want to make sure everyone knows that there will be no movie discussion next month. That we will resume the fourth Thursday in July, which is the 27th. And I'll send an email at the beginning of that month with the choices, because I have to see what the options are, because they change every time. Anyone who hasn't already, if you're on Facebook, please like Katz Reviews, or on Twitter, same thing. And everyone who's on Zoom, if you want to speak, please just raise your hand, and we'll try to catch you when we can.
Figure it out.
Yeah. So the film we're discussing tonight is "Won't You Be My Neighbor" on Netflix, the documentary. And let's start with how we usually start. Show of hands, who liked the movie and thought it was effective? Pretty much everybody, almost. Anybody not like the movie? Marilyn and Andy did not like it. Wow. Oh, and anyone kind of like so-so on it? So, okay, all right. Okay, so pretty much everybody liked it, with 2 exceptions and 1 on the fence. Okay, so Andy, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. If you could just talk to us about what you were ambivalent about with it. What was your hesitation?
To tell you the truth, I think I fell asleep in the middle of the But that's a lot of movies.
Okay.
So expand that. Well, you just say.
Yeah, it just seemed a little trite, boring,
Oh, it's so
like a little
sweet.
substance.
Okay. Howard and Marilyn, comments on why you didn't like it?
Basically, Mr. Rogers, I just remember him. I used to put the TV on at 5 o'clock. My children would sit in front of the TV. They would watch Sesame Street for a half hour, then Mr. Rogers for the next half hour, and I got to make dinner. And it just, you know, I mean, I think he was a great guy. I think he was wonderful with the children. I just didn't enjoy the dynamics of the documentary.
Okay. Howard, any?
No, I kind of agree. It was a documentary,
Oh, we saw you.
which is not more educational than entertaining. And from that standpoint, it was well done, but I like to be entertained.
Okay, so I want to ask, because to me, there were at least 3, maybe 4 moments that actually got me choked up. And as Ann will tell you, I rarely get choked up in a movie. And there were at least 3 in this movie that did.
Yep.
So I want to see if they affected you guys. And I'm thinking particularly of the interview with Coco the gorilla.
Yeah.
Did that get you guys at all?
Yeah.
Actually,
Okay. And then the Erlanger kid who was in the wheelchair.
Oh, yeah.
Very moving.
Yeah.
And you know what somebody told me? I love the movie, by the way, but you know what someone told me? You know the part where he and the black man have his feet in the water?
That was one I was gonna mention that.
By the way, which I didn't know this, but somebody told me it was at the very same time, and I don't remember which state it was, like Alabama, Mississippi, were having those huge
Yeah.
things that they wouldn't let black people in.
Yes.
the pool, and they let the black people in the pool, the white people. wouldn't.
That's why he did it.
And
They showed the film clip of the guy pouring like,
Yeah.
some chemical
Yeah.
in the food.
He made a lot of political, I don't know, but he made a lot of statements about inclusion. That's what he did, the hand. things that I didn't realize when my kids watched
Right.
it that he was doing.
I love when he was in front of Congress.
That was the other one. that did it. Exactly. When he gave the speech, which I'll address in a little bit. 'Cause-
Giving it, but he
Yes.
got his point for us.
Right, and got the money for
Yeah.
PBS.
How about the ending, when he told you to think about people in your life?
Right.
That's what made me.
That was very moving.
Yes,
At
Joel.
I think it was the opening scene where he interacts with that little, like, I think it was a young boy. And that interaction
Yeah, that was great.
just opened the whole thing up to
Right.
what he was about.
Right, right. Good point. Yep. Madeline.
I didn't know anything about really Mr. Rogers, because I never, I'm too old to have watched him, and I didn't have kids. And so just learning about him and really what he stood for, and it's interesting when somebody said, you know, that he made these political statements like with the black guy, and in today's world, we look at that as political. It was more like a moral statement.
It was humanity.
Yeah, a human.
Humanity.
Yeah, and I just was like, wow, he was really showing,
Way before his time.
yes, and yet current.
Yes.
Right.
Well, they said he was a devout, he was almost became a minister.
He was ordained.
He was a minister.
He was a very strong Republican, but nobody cared what your politics were.
Correct.
Right.
But
Okay,
you know
good,
what,
good.
but he embodied as a teacher educator what we taught. Teaching teachers, the main thing for children is to teach self-esteem, number one,
Right.
and positive reinforcement, or they will not nurture them, so they will not grow, they will not learn, and
Right.
he, embodied that within his philosophy.
Yep,
which is,
exactly. Exactly.
Really wonderful.
And I want to also talk not about Mr. Rogers completely. I mean, obviously that's the big focus, but on Morgan Neville, the filmmaker, because he wrote it and directed it and co-produced it, and the way he told the story. Because as a few of you mentioned earlier, there's also a Tom Hanks movie where Tom Hanks played Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, what is that
Seen
called?
that.
Anyone remember what it's called?
Yes, it was a wonderful,
We remember what it was called?
Yes.
something about Be My Neighbor.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Be My-
I think it was.
Yeah.
being-
come to my neighbor, in the neighborhood.
Welcome to the neighborhood or something. Maybe,
people
but
keep telling me about it, and I want to see it.
it's good. I like this better, but it was good. It was good. Okay, all right, so I want to give, Rotten Tomatoes has the consensus on the film, which it was a 97% for the critics and 94% for the audiences. And the quote from the consensus on Rotten Tomatoes was, "Won't You Be My Neighbor takes a fittingly patient and honest look at the life and legacy of a television pioneer whose work has enriched generations." Now, this movie set records as the highest grossing at the box office, and so actually in the theaters,
Wow.
for a biographical documentary with $22.8 million taken in. Which, when you think of movies, that's not a ton for a movie, 22.8. I mean, any of the Tom Cruise movies or Tom Hanks, they tend to make 70, 100
You
million.
wouldn't bring a child to that, so adults made up that number? Going to the movies to see him?
Yeah, I mean, you could have taken kids to it. I mean,
Yeah,
older
they were
kids,
I think.
not
You
like
know why?
under 8.
The kids who watched him, like my daughter. who was saying,
Maybe as adults, yeah.
I love Mr. Rogers in that neighborhood. I have to see that documentary.
Okay,
So
yeah.
Okay.
maybe those people.
An adult, yeah.
So
Yeah.
Ann and I saw it when it came out. We were still in Connecticut, at a theater in Connecticut. And there was a good crowd in the theater. I remember it, but I was not a Mr. Rogers watcher as a kid.
Neither was I.
But I read the reviews. I was like, I want to see this movie. It sounds fascinating. And Morgan Neville made 20 Feet from Stardom, which was a terrific documentary on the Motown backup singers,
Yeah,
um,
that was a good one.
which won the Oscar for him. So the interesting part, so I told you, made 22.8 million at the box office, which was considered great for a documentary.
What year did it come out?
2018, so not too long ago, 5 years. But the production budget was 25 million.
Wow.
I was doing the double take on that. I'm not sure where it went to. He's maybe getting the clips, the rights to it. I don't know, but I didn't see any information as to why it cost so much to make this documentary. But the interesting thing also, did you notice who the producers were? Did anyone see? There's 3 main producers, and one of them is kind of a funny trivia item. So Morgan Neville, His producing partner on many of his movies, Karen Capitosto, I hope I pronounced it right, but I try to find information about her online. Other than seeing her picture and her credits, there's like no biographical information on this woman. She's like
His girlfriend.
invisible. He's married, so I don't know. Not a lot about him either. He's married with kids, not much else other than his.
That they felt that he was homosexual.
No, it's.
I'm talking about the filmmaker, Morgan Neville.
Okay, but as far as Mr. Roberts.
Well, Mr. Rogers, we'll get to that because that was discussed too. So, okay,
Sons weren't jealous.
so this
You said
movie,
what? You said there were 3 producers.
oh, yes, thank you, sorry. So the third is Nicholas Ma. Last name ring a bell? Yo-Yo Ma's son, the producer. And you saw Yo-Yo Ma was in the movie.
Also speaking, was he one of
That
the?
was Yo-Yo Ma.
Yo-Yo Ma was in the movie.
Twice.
No, but was his son the one speaking?
He was interviewed.
He was the interview. He was the interview.
Which,
But Yo-Yo Ma was in-
Yo-Yo Ma was in the movie.
He was in my
Yeah.
class.
I was the teacher,
How about that?
2 years,
Wow. Good student.
92nd Street, New York, Fifth Avenue.
Oh, no.
Next to the Jewish Museum, there was a school.
Yes.
I worked there for a couple of years.
Good student he was?
Oh, yeah. Right. They were all good students. They came in school in limos.
So Nicholas Ma, the son, actually was on the show when he was a child.
Oh, really?
Oh,
A couple of times. He was one of the kids in the studio audience at the show. And it affected him and because Yo-Yo Ma was having a discussion with Fred Rogers about who informed his values. Yes, influence, thank you, his values. And Yo-Yo Ma said, Mr. Rogers. And Morgan Neville started cracking up. And he says, no, I'm serious. And he told him the story and that had him research it. And then he came up, letting me do the documentary on him. And there you go. So that's where it came from, was actually from Yo-Yo Ma. Okay, so the film won the Critics' Choice Best Documentary and Best Director Award. National Board of Review, it won Best Documentary. Producers Guild of America won Best Documentary. So when the Oscars came out to be nominated for Best Documentary, it wasn't nominated. And I remember being totally shocked. I'm thinking this movie's going to win Best, right after we saw it. So this is going to win Best Documentary, and it wasn't nominated. And I'm like, what the hell? What the hell, right? So I read a couple articles about it, and I'm just gonna go there. So goldderby.com said, Won't You Be My Neighbor not showing up in the Best Documentary feature lineup was one of the biggest shockers on Oscar nominations morning. It grossed an astonishing 22.8 million at the box office, dominated critics wins, and was fresh off a victory at the Producers Guild of America Awards. It had long been assumed it would be an easy prediction to call on Oscar night, considering the entire voting academy picks the winners and is receptive to high-profile documentaries about showbiz. And he already directed 20 Feet from Stardom, which did win. So why wasn't it nominated? Deadline had a headline, Diversity Rewarded in Best Documentary Race. This wasn't that much of a diverse movie. So the movies that were nominated were Free Solo, Hale County this evening, Minding the Gap, Of Fathers and Sons, which was a Syrian movie, and RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the one that won was Free Solo.
Really?
I saw it. I was like, pretty pictures, okay. I don't know, it didn't strike me, but for some reason that one won. So in the Deadline story, they talked about timing of it, that it came out too early, so maybe that affected it. Yeah, the beginning of the Oscar race year. That may have affected it, but they said several of the other films had people who were considered minorities at the forefront of the films, and they felt it was a year to celebrate diversity, and there was pressure on the Academy, and that may have affected it.
But it does celebrate diversity.
It does in a little way. But also remember, Mr. Rogers was not a big fan of the guy who played the mailman on his show coming out as gay.
Yeah.
I don't know if repressed it is the right word, but he discouraged him from coming out because he said the sponsors won't like it.
He detained him.
Oh, he accepted him completely right off the bat. He
Right.
accepted him personally,
Detained his.
but he didn't want him coming out publicly because he was afraid they would lose sponsors.
Generation.
Yeah.
Of course. It was, the sixties and seventies, right? But if you remember I don't know if I listed his name here. Francois, I think his name was. Not seeing it here. Yeah, Francois Scarborough Clemens, right? Clemens was his name. And he was very candid about Mr. Rogers treating him well, but discouraging him from coming out. But he said he was, with him all the way. They were friends, and the scene with where he puts his feet in the tub with him was all Mr. Rogers' idea, and he thought it was a beautiful thing, and he always appreciated that he did that, and several other things. Okay, Morgan Neville, the filmmaker, as I mentioned, 20 Feet from Stardom, won the Oscar for Best Documentary, also a Grammy Award for Best Music Film. He also made the documentary Best of Enemies. Did anyone see that? Really good movie. If you haven't seen it, it's about the debates between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley.
Oh, I think.
Okay. Let's see. He made a movie on Johnny Cash, Muddy Waters, Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble. He made a movie on Keith Richards called Under the Influence and Crossfire Hurricane. So he's done a lot with music, which he talked about in an interview I saw online. And he did a lot of things for television. He was an editor for a long time on a bunch of PBS shows as well. He was born in LA, went to University of Pennsylvania, worked as a journalist briefly, but I really couldn't find out much about where he was a journalist before moving into film production in 1993. And yeah, he talked about how music really affects him, it was powerful for him. And okay, there was a PBS interview with him, and he talked about this movie. And there's not a lot about Morgan Neville talking about himself at all, or the movies, but he happened to do an interview for PBS about this movie. And he said, I was born in '67, so I was a first generation Mr. Rogers fan. I loved him as a kid, and I've come to realize he was probably the first significant adult relationship I had outside of my immediate family. I forgot about him for a long time. It was years later when I was working with Yo-Yo Ma, and I happened to ask him how he dealt with fame. And his quick answer was, oh, Mr. Rogers taught me how.
Wow.
I laughed, and he went on to explain it wasn't a joke. Fred Rogers had mentored him over the years into how to use his notoriety as a positive force for social change and not as a lodestone that would weigh him down.
Wow.
He said that made me reevaluate the Mr. Rogers I had remembered and made me realize there was a lot more lurking under the surface. So the interviewer asked him, what was the most surprising, even stunning revelation to you about him in researching and making the movie? Nothing about Fred was a contradiction to who Mr. Rogers was, but in fact was a much more dimensional version full of surprises. If Mr. Rogers is considered a quote wimp, unquote, in popular culture, the real Fred Rogers was the opposite, a man of iron will on a mission and with a real vision. Okay, you've talked about Rogers's radical kindness before. How would you define what that means? What is it actually a risk? Why is it actually a risk to be neighborly and kind to others? And he answered, the kind of words we used around what Fred did, like kindness, neighborliness, niceness, are treated as quaint and old-fashioned. Fred's argument that I think resonates today is that kindness, in fact, is not just window dressing. It's fundamental to how neighborhoods work, which is how communities work and societies work. Without kindness, everything will fall apart. That's sure how it feels now.
Yeah.
And then he said, the film touches everyone who sees it. At the risk of asking you to overanalyze it, what about Mr. Rogers' story do you think touches an emotional nerve with audiences today? And he says, I think Fred spoke like a child in the best sense of the word, which is free of artifice and with sincerity. Fred was able to use this incredible sincerity to reach people's emotional bullseyes. Okay, that's pretty much it. Okay, any thoughts, comments? Yes, go ahead.
They brought up the notion of puppets, which is really powerful because there have been studies where children cannot get up and speak orally in the class, but yet if they have a puppet, they have the confidence and it's not them speaking, it's the puppet. And he used that concept to really put his thoughts out. I mean, he never talked about it, but it was through the puppet.
Daniel the
And
Striped
the
Tiger,
puppet
right?
became him. So
Yep.
it was interesting how puppets took on different personas of how he felt. And they were
Right.
all part of him,
Right.
which was an interesting thing.
Yep, good observation. Yep.
He didn't do it as a ventriloquist. He
No.
spoke in his
No.
own voice.
That's right.
Real loud next to the puppet.
Right,
And then somehow they related that the puppet.
right.
Right.
He changed his voice.
Right, yes, Elizabeth.
This is novelly exciting, but it's interesting. If you ever read The Little Prince, there's a quote in this movie. What is essential in life is invisible to the eye. And that comes from The Little Prince.
Well, you know, I watched that, see, my daughter was hooked on Mr. Rogers, and I never really paid attention. So when I was watching it, I was thinking, I wonder how many lessons she actually learned, because there was a whole thing on divorce. I was divorced, and he explains it. There are a lot of things he explained in there. that I
Grief,
thought to
when we talked
myself,
about grief, I thought that was.
Yeah.
it was wonderful. I thought to myself, now I'm gonna ask her after she watches it, if she was really glued to him, that if she was actually, he was somebody who impacted her life. Because I can
Right.
see that to a kid, they would, who else would talk to a kid like that? Nobody.
He talked about death, like he spent a week talking about
Exactly.
death.
Yes.
Kids, I mean,
Yeah.
I never do that. It was amazing.
I love sex.
Okay, so, all right, I had some notes on Mr. Rogers. All right, I want to get to that later. So yeah, you saw he had scarlet fever as a kid, which obviously affected him significantly. He dealt with the Vietnam War with his character King Friday the 13th. He talked about inclusiveness. We talked about the part where he invited the black mailman to put his feet in the pool with him when that was an issue where blacks couldn't swim with whites in certain parts of the country. I think it was Georgia was shown on the news. Okay, then it noted briefly that he was a staunch member of the Republican Party. And they showed a clip, interestingly, of an M16 rifle commercial for kids, which when you look at it now is very jarring. But as a kid, you know, whatever, kids play army games or did, and it was a thing, but a realistic looking M16 rifle commercial was very jarring to see that. Okay, so PBS TV wanted to cut the budget for the Vietnam War, and as the narrator mentioned, Nixon wanted to cut the budget to help fund the Vietnam War for PBS. So he wanted to cut it. So do you remember they showed the senator, John Pastore from Rhode Island? He was the one in charge and he was looking to cut the funding for PBS. They did not mention that John Pastore was a Democrat. I looked that up, which I thought was kind of interesting. Because you had Nixon as the president, a Republican, wanting to cut PBS's budget, and the guy who was ostensibly really trying to cut the budget, headed the committee, was a Democrat looking to cut the budget, which was kind of interesting because that won't happen today. But you know, Mr. Rogers made the case, and Pastore at first looked very, what was the word? Like impatient with him initially. And I watched the full YouTube clip. It's about 4 minutes. You can find it on YouTube of the interaction they showed between Rogers and Pastore, and how Pastore just his face changes. He just like says, wow, like he marvels at the guy after like 2-3 minutes of him talking. And then he just goes, oh, I think it's wonderful. You know, when he read the lyrics to the song, and he said, looks like you just earned the 20 million.
Right.
I thought that was a great scene. Interestingly, one of Rogers's kids said, it's tough for me to have the second Christ as my dad. So they didn't delve into it deeply, but they did mention it. And the same thing where they talked about, you know, was Fred Rogers gay? The interviewer was asking several people, no, he was not. A family man. And And then the whole thing with the 143, do you remember the 143?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
43 pounds.
143 pounds, but
And that's
that was the address on where the setting of the show was 143.
I love you.
I love
And
you.
that's I love you, 1 letter, 4 letters, 3 letters, and his weight, and he, they showed him swimming. And he also talked about kids with make-believe and pretending they could fly and the dangers of that,
That was really good.
right?
Right.
Yes, David,
So that Tom Snyder interview,
yes.
the
Oh, I couldn't
time,
remember his name.
that was a big, big, big deal.
Right.
It was like something that 40 million Americans, everyone thought, and I remember when it happened, because I was kind of young, but it was a big, big deal that he actually asked him.
He asked him a
national TV,
question.
like, flat out, he didn't say you gay, it was, people didn't use the word gay, though.
No, he said,
Right.
are you straight?
No, he said you
No.
square.
Square, that was it, thank you, yeah.
Square, which was his roundabout way
Yeah.
of getting on, because it was a national TV, it was a
Right.
big deal. And so I told Lloyd, what I took away from this movie more than else, because, when you were a kid, you watched Miracle, we used to make fun of Mr. Lloyd. But it's just, when you think about it now, he was just a nice guy, okay? And we were led to believe that a guy can't be like a nice guy.
Gentle and
The gentle, the sweater thing, the whole thing. We were led to be, guys should be like army guy, big, big rough guys. And that's why we assumed, all of us, that he was gay, because he was nice. There was no nice guys on TV, it just didn't happen.
I
Guys were
think
supposed to
they
be.
say that somewhere in the movie. They
Yeah.
say that everybody on the,
No, but we're all, no matter what anyone says here, everyone thought, had that thing in his head when he used to buy,
Yeah.
in 1970, thought about Mr. Rogers, he's
It was a sweater.
right. No, but when you think about it now, that's said that we have to think that he was just a nice guy, it turns out. He was just a really, really nice.
Yes,
Oh, question. How big an audience did he really have? Because if you look at Fox News, et cetera, who owns what and how they do things, they base it upon the audience, dollars. My impression back in that time, I don't know whether his audience was what it should have been at all. And certainly today, when we need something like that more than ever, I don't know where we stand or if there's anyone out there to replace him in a way. But how
Right.
big an audience did he really have?
okay, so he was on
on
PBS
PBS.
the whole time. But try to remember, back when he started, most places had no cable TV.
Right.
There was ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. That was it. So he had a big audience because there just weren't a lot of options then when he started.
The time of the day, the time of day.
He couldn't make it with adults, remember, he tried and.
Yeah, they tried an adult version and it totally didn't make it, right, right. Right.
Was he, I don't even know, was he on like in the late afternoon? Is where he got home?
Yeah, kids home from school, right. All right, and I wanted to, I wanted to get to something else because you remember the interview with Coco the gorilla?
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, I'll get into it, but we have someone here who actually met Coco the gorilla. Bart, please elaborate.
I was at Stanford University in 1971. I was a research assistant. And yeah, about in the fall or something, I go into the office and I see Pat Patterson, who had just started, I think she might have been a second year doctoral student. I could have been first or second year, something like that. And she's holding this beautiful gorilla. Size of, maybe she was about yay big. She was a baby. Well, I think she was probably about a year old then, something like that. And whoa, I go, it's, Stanford was pretty small then, and it was a psychology department and it was small. And so I go in, we're chatting it up, and there's Coco, and Coco was everywhere, and she's going like this. It was really fun. She's wearing diapers, and so I'm holding Coco, and it's like, wow, it's pretty cool. And then I saw her a couple of times more when Penny would come through with her. But then we saw nothing of her. They went up to the 5th floor. We had no contact with her ever again. Which was sad. I mean, we didn't know that what she became later. I mean, it became so, and I remember, that was the first experience I ever had with holding this gorilla who was just all arms. I mean, have you ever been there? These arms just go forever. And it's kind of a little dangerous.
Yeah.
She didn't pee onto them. And it was so wonderful. She had diapers, but it was so touching. I think years later when Penny left, and then she moved to Hawaii, I think at one point. They moved the whole foundation to Hawaii, I think. And I was in touch with her once at that point, reminding her of her early days, because I think she graduated 2 or 3 years later than that, and then got a doctorate and moved on. And I just followed her story, but I got to say, it was like when I saw Coco, it just touched my heart. It's what we all love to do when we go traveling and we see this, or even in zoos, and that was my certainly first experience ever with being part of this wonderful animal, you know?
I love it.
Anyone else think he looked there?
Yes, at first. So
Big. I would have been pretty scared.
there was a story in the New York Post I found in 2018 called "How Coco Forever Changed the Way We Think About Gorillas." And it starts off, Coco was 13 when she learned her beloved kitten, All Ball, which is a basketball term, died after being hit by a car. Visibly upset, the Western lowland gorilla kept signing the words, sad, frown, cry, bad, and cried out with a hooting sound she made as a baby when left alone in her cage at night. And her longtime caregiver, Penny Patterson, said in 1985, "Those are the only times she gives that cry. It's like someone's leaving me." Coco was already a sensation as the first gorilla to learn to communicate with humans through sign language, but her grief over her pet's death was hard evidence that great apes, once seen only as chest-pounding monsters a la King Kong, could be gentle, empathetic, and human-like. Now it's the world that's mourning. Again, this is 2018. Coco died in her sleep Tuesday morning at her preserve with the Gorilla Foundation in California's Santa Cruz Mountains at age 46. She was born July 4th, 1971. It's at San Francisco Zoo. Her name, Hanabi Ko, means fireworks child in Japanese. She was separated from her mother early in life. And there was a book Patterson wrote in 1981 called The Education of Coco.
When did she get Michael? Because Michael was Coco's friend for a long time.
Oh, that was, that they talked about that in here too. Well, they tried mating Coco with another gorilla first. It didn't happen. And then there was another one. Michael was the second one. The other one died, and then Michael was but it said they were like platonic friends. They were good friends, but that was it. So I did that. By the way, in 1975-76, Coco's IQ was tested and peaked at 95 when she was 5 years old. Not bad, right? In 2012, she stunned scientists by playing wind instruments, including the recorder, harmonica, and party whistles, showing apes could learn to control their breathing, once believed to be beyond their ability. Coco may best be remembered for her love of animals. She became fascinated by tree frogs in her play yard, where she moved in 1979 with her mate, Michael. Noting how Coco would cradle the tiny frogs under her arm to shield them from Michael, a post on Coco's site said it's an outstanding example of Coco's innate gentleness and nurturing spirit towards small, vulnerable creatures. She also obsessed over kittens and adopted the tailless All Ball in 1984. She made the cover of National Geographic showing her cradling her tiny gray tabby kitten. Okay, and she met several celebrities. They mentioned Leonardo DiCaprio, Betty White, Fred Rogers, and Robin Williams.
They didn't mention me in that.
Sorry.
Hey.
She and Williams traded funny faces. She and Williams traded funny faces, and Coco playfully tried on his glasses in their 2001 encounter. And Robin Williams said, "We shared something extraordinary, laughter." And he said it was awesome and unforgettable.
Wow.
And it was one of the first times Coco smiled since Michael's death. More than a decade later, he would go into grieving after learning of Williams's suicide.
Oh, wow.
You may have seen it on the news.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know, understand.
Wait, Coco.
It said her,
Girl.
it was a girl. It was a girl. Her favorite movies were Free Willy, Made in Manhattan, and Pretty Woman. So I thought that was pretty cool. Now, you were talking about the cardigans before, Laura, that you
Yes.
wear the sweaters.
Yes.
So what I read online is the reason he did that, he would come in, take off the coat, put on the
Yes.
sweater, right?
Yeah.
And the reason he did that was because he wanted the viewer, meaning the children, to feel this was like a home
At home.
environment,
Yes.
cozy, warm, welcoming.
Yeah.
The shoes.
He changed
And the shoes, he changed the shoes too, which I don't know, they showed very briefly, Coco took off Mr. Rogers' shoes. And the reason is because Coco watched Mr. Rogers' show every day. And he knew that Mr. Rogers would take his shoes off. So he came in with his shoes on, so Coco took his shoes off. Right, that's pretty cool, right? So I thought that was.
Hey, knock you at 95. And half the group.
All right, so, any other thoughts anyone wants to say right now? I'm gonna go into some of the critical comments. Okay,
Well,
yes,
you talk about money and audience, you have to talk to an advertising.
well,
But there
PBS
isn't
is
any
sponsored. It's
But
sponsored,
do they have other sponsors in there
yes,
who are big supporters of him?
yes, yeah, he had regular sponsors all the time, sure, that's why he was on for 30 years, yeah.
30 years it was.
Yeah, it was 30 something
So
years,
disappointed.
68
It's over.
to 2001. The show ended a couple months or a month or so before 9/11.
But then I did something.
And then they did a special with Mr. Rogers afterwards, and he was being interviewed on how to handle grief and deal with it.
Died when
He was
2018.
so
I think.
disappointed when it was over.
Yeah.
She has her hands up.
Yes, Dan.
No, Rebecca.
Rebecca, yes, go ahead.
She
Muted?
herself.
No, I can't, I have.
Okay, now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so, well, I had watched it before, but I really never put it on years ago because I really thought he was so slow and boring, but watching it, I really thought this man is amazing. I mean, first of all, he wrote every part in the show. He did over 1,000 shows.
And the
And-
song,
And I mean, I never really watched a show if it was in the background there somewhere. And, watching it and seeing that, and then, learning that he became he was the puppets. And then they mentioned that later in life, he became the king. I mean, I don't remember all the names of these things, but he became the king. He got much tougher as a person, and he had the voice of these puppets. And he wrote all, every single part. I mean, he really was an amazing, amazing guy. And he played the piano so beautifully. And he said something, he would talk to the kids and say things. And he said a couple of things last night, but one of them was, what do you feel with the mad you feel? And I thought that was such an interesting line to say to a child. Because who would ever say to a child in 1970 or whatever, what do you feel with the mad you feel? I mean, who even asked anybody's feelings? Or I thought really, I guess kids that really sat and watched that show maybe got something out of it. I wish I had watched it.
yeah, I mean, I remember being a kid and I couldn't get into it. He just kind of creeped me out.
Well, he was also very slow and it was so boring and slow, but obviously some kids loved it and liked him and he really was quite a guy. I just, and also that he was so regimented to swim every day and weigh 143 pounds his whole life. I mean, give me a break. But, it just shows you that this guy could get up and do what he did every day and write that show and interact with the people. And I really think he was just an amazing guy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Um,
And what you just said, that there was something
unusual about him, too bad. I think he did give off those vibes of almost being a pedophile. I mean, he just was, it was something creepy.
Well, that's another thing. You never ever heard that at the end of the day that he, abused kids. Like everybody 10, 15 years later, they abused the kids. But you never heard one thing about him ever. So maybe this was one really decent guy.
The
Right,
kids
Carol?
loved him. I mean, watching it as an adult, you think he's weird, but the kids loved him.
So, some of the reviews I found, and there were a whole bunch. This is from, one of them. I'll just read a few randomly. Get out and go see this, easily one of the best and most necessary films you'll see all year. Another one, it's a moving tribute to a man who lived his life to help others. This was from Memphis, Tennessee. Documentaries are always judged first by their subject, and Neville has a knack for choosing exactly the right ones. Master of documentary structure, he makes the case for Rogers' continued relevance right out of the gate. And now, this is a woman who generally writes about horror films. So I was curious to see, what's her take on this? Won't You Be My Neighbor reminds viewers of the good that is in this world, even in the most challenging of times. The documentary is a wonderful tribute to Mr. Rogers and should be watched by fans young and old. She gave it 5 out of 5. In Australia, Lee Patch from the Herald Sun said, settle in for a quiet and unassuming documentary about a nice man whose simple good intentions made a small but positive difference to the lives of millions of American children. In Lexington, North Carolina, not Kentucky, a truly moving film, a work of profound beauty that exalts the best in all of us by examining the life of a man who truly embodied the best of what humanity could be. Another one, an admirable film, effectively informing the audience about a great man who spread love despite the differences we all have. Another one, Won't You Be My Neighbor is the best kind of documentary as it beautifully explores the life of a great man. Gave it a 10 out of 10. In TV Guide, Matt Roush says, Won't You Be My Neighbor humanizes this icon so prone to parody as he despairs of the wasted potential of TV to, quote, make goodness attractive, unquote, which he achieved with low-key dedication. And speaking of the parody, you remember the Eddie Murphy?
Yeah.
It was funny, right? Eddie Murphy. Well, Mr. Rogers, he wasn't thrilled with it, right? Wasn't thrilled with it. But it was interesting to see Mr. Rogers speak out against violence in children's TV, even cartoon violence. And he just kind of said they can do better. And he challenged them.
He was so slow.
Yeah.
And that's why I think adults couldn't put up with it. Remember when he had showing, that was an
That's
episode
him.
where we
Yeah.
watched here, and he just was slow.
I'm going to say just.
Was this show broadcast in other countries? You know that?
Not generally. I think it was Canada, but I couldn't see if it was beyond Canada. I don't know. Good question. Yeah, because, well, when I read it, like, here's one. Okay, so this is interesting you said that, because there was the mixed review I found was from Australia. And the guy basically said he never saw this growing up because it wasn't available in Australia. But the guy who wrote it, this guy Glenn Dunks, in the Film Experience, again, based in Australia, when it first came out, he wrote, can you ever just be whelmed? Like not overwhelmed or underwhelmed, but just whelmed. Morgan Neville's Won't You Be My Neighbor has proven to be one of the hardest films I've had to write about all year. It's not a film that throws up thorny issues that demand one's full attention or a documentary that challenges the mind. Instead, it's a documentary America has embraced to the tune of some $23 million at the box office and the title of the 12th most successful documentary ever made. It's a film that people have taken to their heart, and yet I sat here with my Word document open on a blank page for far too long. What about this movie failed to inspire me in any way, good or bad? I came to the film late. The legacy of Fred Rogers not having traveled over the Pacific to Australian television sets meant little local audience for Neville's aw shucks brand of childhood nostalgia. Watching Won't You Be My Neighbor, though, it is easy to see how his show became such an American institution. Like the best children's television and cinema, Rogers' efforts at treating young audiences with respect was refreshing. And he had an undeniable knack for recognizing children have a strong perception of the world around them. What kept me at a distance from the film What kept me merely whelmed by the Oscar frontrunner, he calls it when it first came out, Oscar frontrunner, and we don't know what happened, was Neville's direction. The Oscar-winning filmmaker has carved a niche for himself, I suppose, as the man who to tell the stories of his generation. But where 20 Feet from Stardom had energy and pizzazz, and Best of Enemies had venom and vinegar, Won't You Be My Neighbor is so completely and utterly beige in its presentation of Rogers's life and history, which is fine, I suppose. He was hardly the most fascinating individual to get the biodoc treatment this year. But in a year that has given us some truly form-busting, heartbreaking, brilliant works of nonfiction, even in the realm of his historical biography, I unfortunately can't get all that excited either way about it. It's not bad by any means, but is it anything more than just good? Was it overly approved by those with a stake in such things? Who can tell? But there are moments that do threaten to go into some more interesting terrain, but which Neville has seemingly little interest in exploring. Numerous sidebars and potential nooks and crevices of Rogers's life and legacy aren't so much deliberately glossed over, and certainly not maliciously so, as treated with a blasé indifference. I guess you could say the film is as polite as its subject. I guess you could say that can be enough. It's a perfectly genteel film, but rarely gets itself out of second gear. When the credits rolled, I found that I had no strong thoughts on the film at all. Okay, so that was one, yeah, I disagree too. There was a negative review from the Chicago Reader. J.R. Jones wrote, "This general positive treatment of Rogers coincides with the show's values, but devalues his enormous social importance. Neville's crowd-pleasing documentary celebrates the work of Fred Rogers, whose long-running PBS show demonstrated an uncanny understanding of children's emotional lives. Presbyterian minister, he was apparently as wholesome off-screen as on, and though Neville collects some intriguing anecdotes from colleagues and family members, he writes, Rogers could be gruff on the job as he got older. He once prevailed on a cast member to conceal his homosexuality. The star's private life is carefully protected. Nobody wants to hate on Mr. Rogers, so Neville quickly brushes aside the conservative criticism that the show, which exploded in popularity during the me decade of the 70s, may have helped foster our modern American culture of self-involvement and hypersensitivity. The general positive treatment of Rogers coincides with the show's values, but devalues his enormous social importance." One other negative review, just to kind of shed light on it from a different perspective. This was from Toronto. The most impressive and radical part about him was how he acknowledged children's emotions as real, complicated, and worth listening to, never pandering, and always trying to give kids the tools to deal with universal aspects of childhood that were rarely acknowledged. It's a shame then that the person tasked with documenting Rogers' own life story is Morgan Neville, the Oscar-winning director of 20 Feet from Stardom. Unlike Rogers, Neville panders to audiences peddling in mediocrity and documentary tropes simply because they work on the middlebrow audience he caters to. That sounds like he's got a grudge against Neville. Rather than find ways to explore Rogers' issues with depression, insecurity, and isolation growing up as a child, he utilizes animated sequences that show a young Rogers played by his puppet, Daniel Tiger. Some of his friends and relatives believe the puppet represents Rogers' vulnerable and, quote, real self. Tactics like this are familiar, lazy, and simplistic, with Neville's most offensive act involving his withholding the fate of an ill child who went on Mr. Rogers' neighborhood before undergoing major surgery. This is the kind of ill-intentional manipulation Rogers couldn't stand, but it's Neville's bread and butter.
Wow.
So that was the Erlanger kid. Now, did anyone watch the credits at all? Because there was a little surprise about the Erlanger kid in the credits. You see it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, some did, some didn't. So in the credits at the end, they show a grown Erlanger kid.
It's cut off on my table.
Yeah, you have to be careful
Yeah.
when it automatically goes to like.
But he was
some
old.
preview. Right, coming up now. So we stayed and watched it and I'm glad we did. They showed a little clip of Mr. Rogers being honored and the Erlanger kid wheeling out to kind of wish him well. And Rogers jumps up from his seat and goes over to hug him.
Oh, yeah.
One concept that I think.
Well, one second. The only negative which they didn't show in the movie is the Erlanger kid did die a few years after that. He was pretty young. He had this disease that couldn't quite make it. So, but he made it to his late 30s and he did a lot of good. I read about him. You see, he did a bunch of good stuff for people with disabilities. But yes, sorry.
I've always been struck by friends of mine who really were devoted to Mr. Rogers. And when I think about this in the 60s and 70s, he's talking about divorce, he's talking about death, he's talking about racial issues that were taboo, they weren't gonna hear about it. And if I fast forward to now,
Yeah.
he would be overwhelmed by what's happening, especially in this, because I like the name Fred Rodney. Anything about to be on well, I want to talk about things like why little kids have two fathers or two mothers.
Right.
Transgender, all of that. I mean, and it's so ironic that we're celebrating him for bringing up topics that now people would say, oh, kids are too young to know about death. Kids are too young to know about
Divorce.
So it's.
Even when you talk about assassination after Bobby Kennedy, and he recognized that kids would have been seeing it on TV and understanding, and so let's explain to them what this means.
It's surprising, really. Topics that we say are in Florida,
Yeah, no, but I mean, just that he knew enough to talk to kids, not on their level, but like just to talk to them, so they would get to learn what are all these things I'm hearing about? What is?
Question for you.
Yeah.
Different kind of question. I don't know you, this is a wonderful opportunity to enjoy something very special, but did you have any runners up to this particular individual? In other words,
He sends out what the other movies are, so yeah.
were there any other runners, or any other films per se about particular individuals that were very close in value as to this one is?
We didn't vote on it.
No, I picked this one. This wasn't a vote. I just was looking at all the list of movies that were out. I looked at ones that have good reviews. I see the different services and I was like, this one would be a good one to discuss. And that's how I came up with it, because we saw it years ago and I just remembered it was a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
The last movie was kind of polarized the group here. I wanted to have something I thought most people would get behind. But, yeah.
And what film did win the Oscar for that?
With the documentary, it was Free Solo.
No, for that year?
Free Solo.
What is that about?
It was a skateboard movie. I think it was a skateboard. Oh, the climbing one, right. Yeah, the skateboarding one was Minding the Gap. That was a different one.
Yeah.
Right, it was someone who climbed mountains and.
Year that was supposed to be all about diversity, because it's about a white guy. climbing
Yep,
mountains.
I know. I totally didn't get it, but there's,
He came from a wealthy family
The climber?
No.
and he went to school here. He went to school in Winter Park.
yeah, his family put on a big blitz.
And they bought him a house so he could, when he went to college
He went to
in Rollins. So he was there 4 years in a house that they bought him to stay so he could be on campus or whatever. But didn't make any difference. He really was a good guy.
Yeah.
All that money and he didn't have. Yeah.
I don't remember that. Okay.
If you go to Rollins, they have a whole statue. for you.
Yeah,
Right.
I have it.
And who are we talking about, Mr.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers went to Rollins College.
Right.
Orlando.
I stayed on campus there and I didn't see the exact.
Okay, so I don't want to keep it on time. Some interesting trivia I found. I mentioned to you about Coco taking the shoes off and the whole thing. The director was partly inspired. Okay, I mentioned that. Okay. Now, do you remember Lady Aberlin in the show?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, why wasn't she interviewed? Well, the answer was that Morgan Neville did contact her. However, she hadn't, he said she hadn't done an interview in years and felt deeply insecure about going on camera. Which is too bad, because she was an integral part of the show. She was in like all 30 seasons. Yes, Stan.
One thing that bothered me was the very end of the film. First of all, they were talking about was he gay through the whole of it. The question was, and at his funeral, there were people across the street protesting.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Rogers and accusing him of being gay and misleading our children. That was anyway.
That was very.
Right. Well, I mean, okay, I'll get to that too. So there was questions like the message he tried to convey. Did he succeed?
With all those little.
Some
kids, it
people.
certainly helps them.
Right? So much where we are now, those are grown, and I don't know.
These two of them, and I think some of the values that they heard day in and day out.
40s, 50s.
My son, I did, one will be 50, one will be 52. And I really believe they got something out of it. I
And
do
there's a lot of other, obviously, influences on the kids, so, you know, yes.
That's
he
one
was
thing
one
they
of
were watching maybe an hour a day.
people-
Friend,
better than sitting and watching a war movie and.
right, for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as they showed, right.
But we don't presume because all these terrible things are happening, that everyone's doing them. It's really probably a very small, there's a lot of good people.
Right.
They just don't make the news.
Right.
They're not exciting enough.
Yeah, the Sufi says, didn't he show some of the other stuff that's going on TV, that, you know, with the lies?
There was funny language in it, they make believe language, and it's really dumbed down. in the TV series.
Well, I felt bad about the people who said he just raised like entitled children, entitled kids who think they're all special and they're all fabulous, and I felt bad about that.
Yeah, it's like they didn't get it.
Yeah,
But that's also the era when kids played sports, everybody on the team gets a trophy.
Right.
So it,
That was part of the criticism.
yeah,
That was not a good.
so, I mean, it's so it's.
that was later, and not later, when they did that.
No, I don't think, but that is criticized.
Yeah. but they-
I mean, there's nothing wrong with teaching children
to
to
feel
feel.
special. Right.
Right. And
But then they took it to a whole new level.
What's the last 30 years?
So,
Johnny Carson.
yeah, right. So the original title of the movie,
Sesame Street is built on the.
the original title of the movie was going to be The Radical Mr. Rogers.
Oh.
However, in November of 2018, the director revealed that after the election of Donald Trump, the term radical had a negative connotation. He didn't want to go with that. Also, in 2018, former US President Barack Obama listed the film as one of his favorite films of 2018.
So it affected him.
Right. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank everybody for coming on a rainy night. Appreciate it.
I have to go home. Yeah. He's going to.
One second.